The room is unremarkable. That is the first thing you notice. Cinder block walls painted the particular shade of institutional gray that exists nowhere in nature, only in government buildings and prisons. A single overhead fluorescent tube hums at a frequency just below conscious awareness, a vibration you feel more than hear. There is a metal table. There are 2 chairs. There is a man. He sits with his eyes closed. His hands are folded loosely in his lap, not in prayer, not in tension, but in the specific stillness of someone who has learned to make stillness a discipline. His breathing is slow. His face is expressionless. On the table in front of him lies a yellow legal pad and a government-issue ballpoint pen, uncapped, waiting. It is 1973. The facility is in the San Francisco Bay Area, though its precise address is not something that appears in any public record. The men who run this place don't advertise what happens here. The man in the chair has been brought in by an agency whose name you would recognize. He has been given a code number, not a name. He has been asked to do something that every rational framework of the modern world insists is impossible. He has been asked to see. Outside this building, in a location more than 500 miles away, another man is standing at a gate. He has been driven there in an unmarked vehicle. He has been told nothing except to wait. He holds in his hand an envelope. Inside that envelope is a set of geographic coordinates and a photograph, neither of which has been shared with the man in the gray room. The man at the gate doesn't know the man in the room. They have never met. Between them exists nothing but distance. A researcher leans forward across the table and speaks quietly. Begin whenever you're ready. The man in the chair breathes in. He breathes out. And then, in a flat and unhurried voice, he starts to talk. He describes a structure. Low and wide, he says. Some kind of compound. He says the words chain link and watchtower, and then pauses, tilting his head almost imperceptibly, as though listening for something. He speaks of a field to the north, dry ground, the smell of dust. He mentions a sound, mechanical, rhythmic, something rotating. He sketches on the legal pad without opening his eyes. His hand moves with strange confidence. The researcher watches without expression, but his fingers tighten around his pen. Because the man in the room is describing something. He is describing a place. And in the researcher's shirt pocket, folded and sealed, is a document he has not shown to anyone in this building. It contains a description of the target location, the location where the other man is standing right now, 500 miles away, envelope in hand. The man in the chair says, "There's a building. Maybe a hangar. And something. I think it's underground. Something beneath." The researcher opens the document. He reads it. He reads it again. His hands are not steady. Because what the man in the chair has just described, the compound, the watchtower, the field to the north, the rotating mechanism, the underground structure, matches. Not approximately. Not in a general sense that could be explained by educated guessing or statistical coincidence. It matches in the specific, granular, impossible way that makes a trained scientist feel the floor shift beneath him. The room doesn't change. The hum continues. The man in the chair opens his eyes and looks at the researcher and says, quietly, "Did I get anything?" The researcher doesn't answer immediately. He sits very still. And then he does something that no protocol prepared him for. He puts down his pen. He looks at the man across the table. And for just a moment, something passes across his face that is not professional composure. It is something closer to fear. To understand why a classified government program dedicated to psychic phenomena existed for more than 2 decades, you have to understand what fear smells like in the corridors of power. You have to understand the particular texture of the 1970s, a decade that began with American confidence and ended with American exhaustion, a decade of Watergate and Vietnam and oil embargoes and hostage crises, a decade in which the foundational certainties of the post-war world seemed to be quietly dissolving. And underneath all of it, a cold that never left. The Cold War. A confrontation without a battlefield, a war fought in shadows and signals and intelligence estimates, a competition where the currency was not territory but information, and where the fear was not just of missiles but of the unknown, specifically, of what the other side might know that you didn't. In the early 1970s, that fear acquired a specific and deeply unsettling shape. American intelligence analysts began receiving reports from behind the Iron Curtain. The reports were fragmentary, sometimes second-hand, often filtered through the particular lens of Soviet bureaucracy, which had its own way of making the bizarre sound clinical. But the pattern they described was unmistakable. The Soviet Union, it appeared, was funding research into psychic phenomena, not as entertainment, not as cultural curiosity, as a weapon. The CIA received a report in 1972 suggesting that the Soviet Union had spent millions of rubles on what they called psychotronics, a term that covered everything from ESP to remote influence to telepathy. The report referenced a facility near Novosibirsk. It referenced a researcher named Nina Kulagina, who appeared in Soviet film footage to move objects without touching them. It described programs that had run for a decade with serious institutional backing. Whether any of it was true was almost beside the point. The point was that the Soviets believed in it enough to fund it, and in the logic of Cold War competition, that belief itself became a threat. "We cannot afford a psychic gap," one analyst reportedly wrote in an internal memo that has since been declassified. The phrase is almost comic in retrospect. But in 1972, with the gap in question being the gap between what America knew about its enemy's mind-reading capabilities and what it didn't know, the fear was entirely sincere. Into this climate of strategic anxiety walked two men who would change the course of the program, and who would spend the next 2 decades in a peculiar kind of purgatory, caught between worlds that neither fully accepted them. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff were physicists. That is the first thing to say about them, and the most important, because it established their credibility in the early days and also, eventually, their vulnerability. They were not occultists. They were not credulous enthusiasts. They worked at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, and they approached the question of psychic phenomena the way physicists approach anomalies, with instruments, protocols, control conditions, and a determination to find out what was actually happening, even if what was actually happening turned out to be nothing. Puthoff had been interested in the possibility of unusual human perceptual abilities for years. He was also, at this point in his career, in quiet contact with the CIA, which was casting a wide net for anything that might give America an edge in the intelligence competition with the Soviets. When Puthoff wrote a letter to the agency suggesting that the phenomena deserved serious investigation, he did not expect what happened next. He expected, perhaps, a polite bureaucratic dismissal. What he got instead was a phone call, and then a visit, and then funding. But funding requires results. And results, in this case, required a subject. His name was Ingo Swann, and he defies easy description. He was a painter, a legitimate one, with gallery shows and a developed aesthetic theory. And he was also something else, something he had known himself to be since childhood, something that had no respectable name in the lexicon of late 20th century empirical America. He believed, with the quiet certainty of personal experience rather than argument, that his mind was capable of things that other minds were not. Or perhaps that all minds were capable of these things, and that he had simply paid attention in a way others hadn't. Swann arrived at SRI in early 1972 and submitted himself to a series of experiments that were, by his own account, both rigorous and surreal. In one experiment, a magnetometer, a device that measures magnetic fields, was buried in a superconducting shield beneath the floor of the lab, isolated from external influence. The researchers asked Swann to affect it with his mind. He sat. He concentrated. He described what he said he was perceiving about the device's interior. And then the magnetometer's output, which had been running flat, as it should, began to change. The frequency doubled. Then it halted. Then it changed again. The researchers checked the equipment. They checked it again. There was no conventional explanation for what the data showed, which left them with two possibilities. Either there was an unconventional explanation, or something unconventional had happened. Neither possibility was comfortable. Both demanded investigation. It was out of this moment, this unsettling, ambiguous, scientifically troubling moment, that remote viewing was born. Not as a belief system. Not as a metaphysical claim. As a research protocol. A controlled, documented, reproducible attempt to determine whether a human mind could acquire information about a distant location or object without any conventional sensory access to it. The name itself was clinical, deliberately shorn of the mystical associations that would have made the program radioactive in Washington. Remote viewing. As though the mind were simply a camera pointed in the wrong direction, and all that was needed was to turn it around. But this was only the beginning. The CIA's initial contract with SRI was modest, $50,000, the kind of money that buys deniability as much as research. If it produced nothing, the agency could walk away. If it produced something, the agency could expand. This is how intelligence organizations navigate the unnavigable. They fund the question without committing to the answer. What they got from those early experiments was not nothing. The data Targ and Puthoff collected from their sessions with Swan, and soon with other subjects, showed a pattern they hadn't expected and couldn't fully explain. Across hundreds of trials, the descriptions provided by their subjects corresponded to the target locations at a rate that statistical analysis suggested could not be attributed to chance alone. Not every description matched. Many were vague, fragmented, impressionistic. But some were specific. Some were startlingly, uncomfortably specific. The scientific establishment greeted these findings with the particular coldness reserved for research that threatens foundational assumptions. The criticism was methodological, which is always the most powerful kind, because it attacks not the conclusion but the process, and a flawed process can render any result meaningless. Critics argued that the experimental controls were inadequate, that the judges evaluating the transcripts knew too much, that the data had been selectively reported. Targ and Puthoff pushed back. They tightened their protocols. They invited outside reviewers. The debate continued, and continues still. But inside the machinery of American intelligence, the debate had a different texture. The people running these programs were not philosophers of science. They were men and women trying to do a specific, practical job in a specific, dangerous world. And the question they kept returning to was not, is remote viewing real in some absolute metaphysical sense? The question was, could it be useful? By the late 1970s, the program had migrated from the SRI laboratory into the United States Army. The intelligence arm of the Army established a unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, a unit that would, over the next decade, go through a series of name changes, organizational reshufflings, and funding crises, all while continuing to do the same essential thing: train soldiers to sit in rooms and describe places they could not see. The men recruited for this program were not mystics. They were soldiers, chosen for their psychological stability and their clearances and, initially, their skepticism. The Army didn't want true believers. True believers can talk themselves into anything. The Army wanted men disciplined enough to report accurately, to distinguish between what they were genuinely perceiving and what they were inventing, to hold ambiguity without resolving it falsely in either direction. This, it turned out, was harder than it sounded. Joe McMonigal was one of them, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a near-death experience that had, by his account, permanently altered his relationship to the borders of ordinary perception. He was not someone who wore his strangeness openly. He wore uniforms and saluted and spoke the language of military discipline, and underneath all of that was something he could neither fully explain nor fully suppress. a capacity for perception that his superiors were determined to measure and, if possible, weaponize. The training was intensive and strange in equal measure. The viewers, as they came to be called, were taught a method called coordinate remote viewing, later refined into a more structured protocol. They were given geographic coordinates and asked to describe what was at those coordinates. They were taught to distinguish between what they called analytical overlay, the mind's tendency to interpret raw impressions through the filter of logic and prior knowledge, and the raw impressions themselves. They were trained, essentially, to report the signal rather than the story the brain automatically constructs around it. The difficulty of this training reveals something important about the epistemological terrain the program was navigating. If you tell someone to close their eyes and describe a distant location, their mind will, automatically and helplessly, begin to construct narratives. It will interpret fragments as familiar objects. It will impose meaning on sensation. This is not a failure of imagination. It is the basic operation of human cognition. The remote viewing protocol was an attempt to strip that process back, to find whatever was underneath. And whether there was anything underneath was precisely the question no one could answer with certainty. And then something happened that no one could easily dismiss. In 1979, American intelligence received information suggesting that a Soviet submarine, one of the new Typhoon-class vessels, carrying ballistic missiles, had disappeared from satellite tracking. The loss of contact with a Soviet nuclear submarine was not simply a military problem. It was an intelligence problem of the highest order. Where was it? What was it doing? Was it a technical failure or a strategic repositioning? These questions mattered in ways that could not be overstated. In a quiet room at Fort Meade, a senior officer made a decision that was either desperate or pragmatic, depending on your perspective. He authorized a remote viewing session targeting the submarine. The viewer was given only that a target existed, no description, no geographic context. He sat. He closed his eyes. He began to describe. He described water. He described darkness and cold and the interior of something metallic, curved walls, the specific acoustic quality of an enclosed space underwater. And then he described something specific, a shape, a structure, something attached to the hull that he said was new and not standard. He sketched it. Weeks later, when the submarine was eventually relocated by conventional intelligence means, the analysis of available data would suggest, though would never definitively confirm, given the compartmentalized nature of the information, that the viewer's description contained elements that corresponded to a modification the Soviets had recently made to that class of vessel. A modification that was not in any American intelligence database at the time of the session. This is the texture of Project Stargate's most significant claims, and it is important to sit with that texture rather than resolve it too quickly. The correspondence was not perfect. It was not a blueprint. It was impressionistic, fragmentary, interpretable in multiple ways. Critics would later argue that the interpretation had been shaped by confirmation bias, that people who wanted to see a match had found one in material vague enough to support various readings. The advocates would argue that the specificity was real, that the sketch matched the modification, that no conventional explanation existed. No one who wasn't in that room with full access to both the session transcripts and the classified intelligence data can say with certainty who was right. And that is the condition in which Project Stargate lived, and still lives, in the historical record. Not confirmed. Not refuted. Suspended. The program's most celebrated and contested mission involved something more personal than submarines. In 1979, just months after the submarine session, the Iranian hostage crisis began. 52 American citizens, employees of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, were held captive by revolutionary forces. The crisis would last 444 days and consume the Carter administration. American intelligence was working every possible channel. At Fort Meade, they worked one more. Remote viewers were tasked against targets related to the hostages, locations, conditions, movements. The sessions generated transcripts that were, by the accounts of participants, sometimes strikingly accurate about the general conditions of captivity and sometimes wildly wrong about specifics. Nothing generated by the viewers was used operationally in the rescue attempt, which failed tragically for reasons that had nothing to do with psychic intelligence. But the sessions continued, and the debate about what they had and hadn't revealed continued alongside them. What the program's defenders always returned to was not any single dramatic success but the aggregate pattern, the statistical weight of hundreds of sessions that, when evaluated blind, produced results that seemed, in the view of statisticians who examined the data, to exceed chance at odds that demanded explanation. The explanation the program's advocates offered was remote viewing. The explanation the skeptics offered was methodological error, selection bias, and the human mind's extraordinary capacity to find patterns in noise. Neither side could fully prove its case. And so the program continued. There is something that the official histories of Project Stargate tend to skip past, perhaps because it doesn't fit easily into either the triumphalist narrative of the believers or the debunking narrative of the skeptics. It is the human cost of living inside this kind of ambiguity, of spending years in a classified program that asks you to trust perceptions that your entire cultural conditioning tells you are impossible, and to do so professionally, repeatedly, under evaluation, while also maintaining the outward normalcy of a government employee with a clearance and a desk and a parking space. The viewers described psychological experiences that don't map cleanly onto either "I was accurate" or "I was mistaken." They described sessions that felt like genuine perception, a vivid, specific, undeniable sense of being somewhere they weren't, and sessions that felt like nothing at all, like trying to read a book in a language you don't speak. They described the difficulty of not knowing, afterward, whether what they had reported was real or invented, whether the praise they received for an apparently accurate session reflected genuine success or the evaluator's desire to believe. Joe McMonigal, who would become arguably the most well-documented remote viewer in the program's history, spoke later of what he called the burden of not knowing. Of being asked, for years, to do something whose validity couldn't be confirmed in real time, and to do it under the weight of the knowledge that if you were wrong, if this was all elaborate self-deception, then the work of your professional life was built on nothing. And if you were right, if the data meant what some people claimed it meant, then the implications extended so far beyond the program itself that there was nowhere comfortable to look. Ingo Swann, for his part, was not plagued by doubt in the same way. He was certain in the way that direct experience creates certainty, the way you are certain that you are in pain or in love, not because you have proved it but because it is happening to you. This certainty made him valuable to the program and also, eventually, difficult. He was not interested in the program's bureaucratic limitations. He was not interested in the careful, qualified, defensible language that institutional science requires. He believed that what he was doing was real, that the scientific establishment's refusal to accept it was a failure of nerve rather than a legitimate epistemological position, and he was not particularly good at hiding this opinion. The tension between Swann's certainty and the program's need for methodological defensibility was never fully resolved. It played out in disagreements about protocols, in sessions that were later disputed, in a gradual drift between Swann and the SRI researchers that ended in his departure from the formal program in the mid-1980s. He continued his work independently, writing and lecturing and training other viewers, insisting until his death in 2013 that the phenomenon was real and that its reality had been adequately demonstrated and deliberately suppressed. Whether he was right about the suppression is one of the program's genuinely open questions. Not everyone inside the program believed. This is important and often forgotten in narratives that frame Project Stargate as a unified effort by dedicated believers against a skeptical establishment. The reality was more complicated, more human, more interesting. There were people inside the program, people who worked within it, who administered it, who evaluated its sessions, who harbored serious doubts about what they were seeing, and who found themselves in the ethically and professionally uncomfortable position of working on something they weren't sure was real. Some of them said so, in classified memos that have since been released under FOIA requests. The memos make for striking reading. They describe concerns about the evaluation process, specifically, about whether the judges assessing whether a remote viewing description matched its target were adequately isolated from the knowledge of what the target was. They describe worry about the file drawer problem, the tendency in any research program to highlight successes and quietly retire failures. They note that the operational use of remote viewing in actual intelligence contexts, as opposed to controlled laboratory conditions, had produced results that were, in the aggregate, much more ambiguous than the program's advocates acknowledged. One internal review, dated 1986, concluded with a line that has a kind of bleak elegance about it: the program has not demonstrated operational utility proportionate to its costs. This was bureaucratic language for something simpler and more damning. We have spent money and time and institutional capital on this, and we cannot show that it works well enough, often enough, in ways specific enough to justify what it costs. The program survived this review. It survived it because the alternative, canceling the program outright, carried its own risk. If the Soviets were still funding psychic research, and the Americans stopped, and the Soviets found something, then the people who had canceled the American program would have to answer for that decision. In the Cold War, the cost of being wrong in the direction of paranoia was always lower than the cost of being wrong in the direction of complacency. And so the program continued, underfunded and embattled, into the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Cold War itself was ending. The Soviet Union was cracking from within. The pressures of economic dysfunction and political delegitimization, and the particular exhaustion of a system that had promised everything and delivered much less. The threat that had justified Project Stargate, the Soviet psychic research program, the psychic gap, was quietly being reassessed. American analysts looking at what was actually happening inside Soviet psychotronics research were finding something uncomfortable. A great deal of it appeared to be fabricated. The reports that had alarmed the CIA in the early 1970s were, in some cases, deliberate disinformation. The Soviets feeding American intelligence agencies false information about their psychic capabilities, knowing that the Americans would feel compelled to match whatever the Soviets appeared to have. It was a perfect trap, and the Americans had walked into it. For 20 years. Or had they? Because even if the Soviet program was partly or entirely fictional, the American program had generated its own data, independent of the Soviet threat that had motivated it, and that data remained unexplained. If you removed the Cold War context entirely and looked only at what Targ and Puthoff and the Fort Meade viewers had actually produced, the transcripts, the sketches, the session records, you were still left with something that statistical analysis suggested could not be entirely noise. The question of what that something was didn't go away just because the political justification for investigating it had. By 1994, the program was operating under the name Project Stargate, a designation that had consolidated several predecessor programs under a single umbrella, and it had been transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency. The DIA was not, institutionally, enthusiastic about what it had inherited. The program felt, to many people in the organization, like a liability. Expensive to maintain, impossible to defend publicly, and producing results that were too ambiguous to be operationally useful but too interesting to be entirely dismissed. Congress, which had been funding the program through the intelligence black budget for years, began asking questions. The questions had a particular edge. Not the outright hostility of people who knew it was nonsense, but the sharper, more dangerous skepticism of people who suspected it might be nonsense and wanted to know for certain before they were on record supporting it. In Washington, few things are more politically toxic than being associated with a program that the press will describe, inevitably, as psychic spies. The decision was made to commission an independent review. The American Institutes for Research, a respected behavioral science organization, was contracted to examine the program's database, assess its methodology, and render a verdict on whether remote viewing was a real phenomenon that deserved continued investment. The review team included 2 external evaluators. One was Ray Hyman, a psychologist and longtime skeptic of psychic claims, a man who had spent decades examining the evidence for ESP and finding it consistently inadequate. The other was Jessica Utz, a statistician from the University of California, who approached the data without a prior commitment to either position and found herself arriving at a conclusion that surprised her. Utz concluded, after her analysis of the experimental database, that the statistical evidence for remote viewing was robust, that the results exceeded chance at a level that, in any other field of research, would be considered significant. She wrote that if the same data had been produced in a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical drug, the drug would have been approved. Her conclusion was not that the mechanism was understood, or that it was psychic in some supernatural sense, but that something was happening in the data that deserved serious scientific attention. Hyman agreed that the statistics were difficult to dismiss. He disagreed that this was sufficient justification for accepting the reality of the phenomenon, arguing that there could be unidentified methodological flaws that the statistical analysis couldn't detect. He called for independent replication under conditions that even the most rigorous critic could not challenge. He was not saying it was fake. He was saying it wasn't proven. The report was released in 1995. It was not the unequivocal debunking that program critics had hoped for. It was not the validation that its defenders had waited 2 decades to receive. It was a document that managed to be simultaneously inconclusive and damning. Inconclusive about the science, damning about the operational utility. The Air Review found that remote viewing had not produced information of sufficient specificity, reliability, or verifiability to justify its use in intelligence operations. The methodology had never been clean enough to satisfy the scientific establishment. The operational results had never been clear enough to satisfy the intelligence community. In 1995, the CIA, which had by this point reassumed administrative responsibility for what remained of the program, made its announcement. Project Stargate was terminated. 23 years after the first contract with SRI, after more than $20 million in funding, after hundreds of sessions and thousands of pages of transcripts and the careers of men and women who had given their professional lives to a question no one could answer, the program was over. Or so they said. The declassification of Project Stargate's files in 1995 was, in its own way, as strange as anything that had happened inside the program. The American public, confronted with the revelation that its intelligence agencies had spent 20 years and $20 million investigating psychic phenomena, responded with a mixture of mockery, fascination, and the particular flavor of unease that comes from learning that institutions you depend on are more complicated than you thought. The late-night comedians had a field day. The newspapers wrote about psychic spies, with the barely suppressed glee that characterizes press coverage of official embarrassments. Congressional critics who had quietly supported the program's funding for years now stood at podiums and expressed appropriate incredulity. The program's former participants, now free to speak, though with varying degrees of candor, found themselves navigating a public that wanted either confirmation of the supernatural or comfortable reassurance that it was all nonsense, and that had little patience for the complicated middle ground where the evidence actually lived. Joe McMonigle wrote a book. Ingo Swann wrote several. Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff continued to research and publish in journals that operated at the margins of mainstream science, peer-reviewed enough to have academic legitimacy but far enough from the center that the mainstream could comfortably ignore them. They did not, any of them, recant. They did not say it had been nothing. They said the data was real, that the program had been mismanaged and under-resourced and politically compromised, and that the question it had asked remained unanswered. What the declassified documents revealed, when researchers and journalists and interested members of the public actually read them, was something more nuanced and more troubling than either the debunkers or the believers had suggested. The files showed a program in constant tension with itself, genuinely anomalous results sitting alongside genuine methodological failures, moments of apparently remarkable accuracy nestled alongside sessions so vague they could describe anything, researchers who believed passionately alongside administrators who doubted quietly, all of it sustained for 2 decades by a combination of Cold War fear, genuine scientific curiosity, and the bureaucratic inertia that makes government programs hard to kill once they've been started. The files also revealed something about the nature of the question itself. Remote viewing, as the program defined and studied it, was not a binary phenomenon, either real or not real, present or absent. It was, if it was anything, a variable and unreliable signal in a great deal of noise, something that appeared sometimes, in some people, under some conditions and not others. This is the kind of phenomenon that is hardest for science to handle, because it resists the clean, reproducible demonstration that scientific consensus requires. You cannot prove the existence of lightning by standing in a field and waiting for it to strike in a specific spot. You can only accumulate observations over time and argue about what they mean. In the years since the program's closure, a small but persistent scientific community has continued to investigate what they call psi phenomena, remote viewing, telepathy, precognition, under increasingly rigorous conditions. Meta-analyses of the experimental database suggest that the effect, whatever it is, persists across studies and across researchers, at odds that remain difficult to attribute to chance. The scientific establishment remains largely unconvinced, not because the evidence doesn't exist but because the existence of the evidence doesn't fit the framework within which the establishment operates. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And the evidence for remote viewing, however suggestive, has never risen to the level of extraordinary. But the program didn't end there. Not really. Not in the way that matters. There is a document in the National Archives. It is 47 pages long and was classified for 17 years before being released in response to a FOIA request in 2003. It contains transcripts of remote viewing sessions conducted at Fort Meade in 1984. Sessions that, to the people who have read them carefully, contain descriptions that are difficult to explain. One session, conducted by a viewer who was given only a numerical coordinate, produced a description of a location that the evaluators later matched to a facility in the Soviet Union, a facility that was not known to American intelligence at the time of the session and that was confirmed by satellite reconnaissance 18 months later. The viewer described the layout of the facility, the height of its fences, the materials used in its construction, the presence of vehicles of a specific type, and one additional detail, a large structure being built underground, beneath the facility's northeastern quadrant, for a purpose the viewer said they could not determine. The satellite reconnaissance, conducted in 1986, confirmed the facility. It confirmed the fence height. It confirmed the vehicle type. It did not confirm the underground structure, because the satellite's resolution was insufficient to detect construction at that depth. The underground structure question remains, technically, open. This is the kind of detail that the debunkers say is meaningless, too vague to be verified, too specific to be dismissed, existing in the interpretive space where motivated reasoning can find anything it looks for. And they may be right. The history of paranormal research is littered with apparently compelling cases that dissolved under closer examination, and the lesson of that history is that compelling is not the same as true, that the mind's desire to find meaning is more powerful than most people want to acknowledge. But the believers, the former viewers, the researchers who spent decades with the data, the statisticians who ran the numbers and found them troubling, say something that is harder to dismiss than it might seem. They say, look at the aggregate. Don't look at any single case. Look at the whole body of evidence, across 23 years, across hundreds of sessions, across multiple researchers working in multiple locations with multiple subjects. Look at what the statistics say about that aggregate, with no commitment to what it means. And what the statistics say, even accounting for methodological criticism, even conceding the selection bias, even allowing for all the legitimate scientific objections, is that the effect is there. Something is in the data. Something that doesn't go away when you apply the usual corrections. Something that has no name that science is currently comfortable using. The men and women who participated in Project Stargate are, most of them, old now. Some have died. The ones who remain speak of the experience with a mixture of pride and something else. Something that sounds, when you listen carefully, like unfinished business. They don't claim to have solved anything. They claim to have found something that needed solving, and to have been given just enough time and resources to determine that the question was real before the institutional will to answer it ran out. McMonigle, in his later writing, returned again and again to a specific session. Not the most dramatic one, not the one that got the most attention in the post-declassification coverage, but a quiet session from the early 1980s, a target he was given with no context, a location he described in terms that meant nothing to him at the time and that were only explained to him years later. He described a desert. He described structures that were low to the ground and partially buried. He described something moving in the distance, vehicles, he thought, though their shape was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He drew a sketch. He turned it in. He forgot about it. Years later, reviewing his declassified files, he came across the sketch. And beside it, in an evaluator's handwriting, 2 words had been written, and then partially crossed out, as though the writer had thought better of including them, but not thoroughly enough. Matches target. What does it mean to match a target? In science, it means the description corresponds to the ground truth in a way that exceeds chance at a level that demands explanation. In intelligence work, it means the information was useful, that it helped someone make a better decision than they would have made without it. In human terms, it means something rarer and more unsettling. It means a man sitting in a gray room with his eyes closed reached out into the world with nothing but his mind and found something that was actually there. Or it means the human mind is so extraordinarily good at pattern recognition, so efficient at constructing narratives from fragments, so motivated by the desire to see itself as extraordinary, that it can convince itself, and trained evaluators and statistical analysts, and a government that spent $20 million over 23 years, that it is perceiving something when it is only imagining. And the distance between those two possibilities, genuine perception and sophisticated self-deception, is a distance that 23 years of classified research did not close. The gray room is empty now. The metal table, the 2 chairs, the yellow legal pad, all of it long since repurposed or discarded or moved to a storage facility somewhere in the vast anonymous infrastructure of the American government. The men who sat in that room are living their lives in the ordinary world, the world where the mail comes and the news cycles and the days arrive and depart with the comfortable predictability of things that follow known rules. But the question they were asked to answer, the quiet, radical, impossible question of what the mind is capable of how far perception can reach, of whether there are ways of knowing that our instruments cannot yet measure, that question did not go into storage. It did not get declassified and absorbed and resolved into the comfortable consensus of the known. It remained open. It remains open still. The program ended. The question didn't. Somewhere, in an archive that may or may not have been fully declassified, there are session transcripts that have not been released. There are evaluations that have not been made public. There are descriptions of targets that remain classified, matched against ground truths that remain classified, yielding conclusions that remain classified. The program may have ended in 1995. The information it generated did not disappear. And in a field somewhere, or a facility, or a building with low fences and vehicles of a specific type parked outside, something that was once described by a man with his eyes closed in a gray room in California may still be doing whatever it was doing when his pencil moved across the yellow legal pad, and his breathing slowed, and his face went still, and he began to speak about a place he had never been and could not see. The only question left, the one that 23 years and $20 million could not answer, that no amount of classified research or independent review or congressional scrutiny or public disclosure was sufficient to resolve, is whether the mind can reach farther than we are willing to accept.